everyone for tuning in today on your lunch breaks. So this is the kickoff of our Law Week presentation, so welcome. Today's topic that we're covering is knowing your rights at work, a brief overview of the key things to keep in mind while you are working for an employer, as well as the places to reach out to if you've ever got any concerns in relation to your employment. So I'd like to start by first acknowledging the Aboriginal people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I am presenting from today. I acknowledge that this land holds structures of law which were practiced for thousands of generations, and I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. A brief disclaimer before we get into the content today is that this is not a substitute for legal advice. If you do have a problem that may be requiring legal advice, we really recommend that you seek some assistance from a lawyer in relation to that concern. Today is really legal information that is broad, and if you do have any specific questions that relate to your employment, we'd recommend that you reach out after the presentation to discuss that further with us. So if you're not familiar with Marrickville Legal Centre, a quick little rundown of what we do and what we're about is that we provide free legal services to those who either cannot afford it or are not able to seek assistance from legal aid. So we provide legal services in a number of core areas of law. We cover criminal law, family law, tenancy, housing, employment law, civil law, traffic, discrimination law, and a number of different areas that don't necessarily fit within their own brief. If we don't cover an area of law, we usually know where to put someone in touch with to get assistance with that area of law. We've also got a domestic violence support service as well. So we try to offer assistance in as many ways as we can. And I think Tu has just popped in our website to the chat so that you can have a look at some more information around each of those areas of law if you're unsure of any issues you may have and whether they fit within what we can assist with. So today we're going to be covering a few different areas of employment law and some common issues that we see at the centre coming up with people's problems when they're coming to us. So we'll be covering underpayments. We'll also look at bullying and sexual harassment in the workplace. We'll look at unsafe conditions and what your employer is required to provide you in terms of a safe workplace. We'll also look at unfair dismissal and the things to look out for if you feel that your dismissal may have been unfair or unlawful. So something that is always required when you start working with an employer is to provide your tax file number. It does feed into the underpayment side of things when we're looking at employment issues. And it's really important to know, particularly if it's your first job in Australia or your first job after leaving school or whenever it may be, that it's important that your employer takes your tax file number down when you start. And so what they do is they'll give you a form and they'll ask you to fill it in within the first pay cycle. And in short, a tax file number is a personal reference number that can link up for tax and super, so that then if your employer is making any payments on top of your wages for superannuation, or if they're deducting tax, that's actually being paid and is attributed to your tax file number. If you don't have one, the link in these slides will take you to the page where you can apply for a tax file number with the ATO. And I think we're sharing these slides, aren't we, too, at the end? So you'll be able to click on that hyperlink to go through there if you do not already have one. So when we're looking at underpayments, there's a lot of different factors that come into play, which is why it's really important to get help on a case-by-case basis and not to generalise your own employment, or if you've got a friend who might know a little bit about employment in the workplace, to make sure that while that's really helpful, that you get some specific advice, because there are so many different types of employment and contracts of employment can have so many different details in them that can be specific to you, that it really comes down to each person and the contract they've got with their employer. But broadly, you'll see a lot of different categories like we've got listed here that are most commonly that people are employed. So we've got full-time employment, which is where you're working 38 to 40 hours a week. You are entitled to things such as annual leave and sick leave. We've got part-time there, which is where you're working set hours per week that are agreed to in writing, but they're still less than 38 hours per week. So that might be that you are contracted to do 21 hours per week, or just a set number of hours that you've both agreed you'll work each week and week in, week out. Casual employment is something that we're all very familiar with, and we often see in the media, is where you are employed on an as needed basis. And technically speaking, each shift is the start and end of your employment. So you start at 8, you finish at 5. There's no guarantee that you'll be getting another shift next week at that same time. So there's a lot of flexibility in casual employment, but also it can pose a lot of issues if an employer doesn't know how to handle their casual workforce. And we do find that people do come seeking help if they are a casual employee, just making sure that they're being treated properly in the workplace. Apprentices and trainees are another area that are quite complicated, in that there are generally third parties that can put people in touch with someone who is an apprentice or someone who is wanting to do a traineeship, and they have a lot of say in the way that that traineeship or apprenticeship plays out. So if you do agree to take on an apprenticeship or a traineeship with where it's kind of blended with your day-to-day work, it's really important to make sure that you understand the terms of your contract and that you understand how long the apprenticeship goes for, what the rates of pay are, and because they can differ, because you're getting education while you work, that you make sure that you double check those things, that they're all above board and they're all correct. The last one here is independent contractors, and this is where we can see companies potentially using independent contractors to avoid their obligations as an employee. So this might be a situation where you find you've been asked by a company to set up an ABN, but then for all other intents and purposes, you're treated like an employee. It's just that they're doing that so that they don't have to pay you leave, they don't have to pay super, and they're potentially avoiding paying tax. So they're all things that it's really important to double check. If you've been asked to set up an ABN before you start working, is why, and is it truly something where you are an independent contractor and you have a say in the work you do? Or is it a situation where you're being treated like an employee and you have no input over your day-to-day work?
Yeah.
So I'll just ask if anyone's got their speakers on, if you could please mute them until the question and answer portion of the presentation. There's just a little bit of feedback coming through. Thank you, everyone. So another thing that is important with looking at underpayments, and the first thing that we check as lawyers helping people with any concerns they've got on their pay slips or in their contract, is checking it against the national minimum wage. And this figure changes each year, but everyone working in Australia is entitled to that minimum wage. The only time that that may change is if you are under 21, that is prorated down. So it is important, if you are between the ages of 16 and 21, that you double check what the appropriate minimum wage is for your age. If you're over 21 and you're working in any capacity, your pay should be at the very least the national minimum wage. If you're a casual employee, you then get at least a 25% casual loading on top of the wage. So at the moment, I believe it's $20.33. So then if you are a casual, you add another 25% on top of that for your hourly rate. Another important thing is that in a lot of different industries, there may be a specific modern award that covers that type of work. And some common ones that we see are like the retail industry award, hospitality, manufacturing and warehouse, transport drivers, general ones like the Clark Private Sector Award and the Professional Employees Award. I mean, there's so many that cover different areas and have specific additional entitlements that complement the minimum wage. So it's important to check that if one of those may apply, how it applies to your employment. There's a number of great resources that the Fair Work Ombudsman and the Fair Work Commission have where you can do it yourself insofar of typing in the role that you've got or what you think your role is, and it'll start giving you options as to what awards may cover you in that role. While it's still not legal advice, it's a really good first step to look into if you're trying to figure out your entitlements or if you're unsure of what you're being paid or what you should be paid. Sorry, that's just the car having a phantom horn go off. I do apologise for the noise. Hopefully it won't. Okay, it's gone. If that happens again, I do apologise. The car is on its last legs and saying goodbye by the sounds of it. Yeah, so if there's a modern award that covers you, it's really important to have a look yourself, check your contract, and if you're unsure after looking at both of those things, then reaching out either to the Fair Work Ombudsman or to your local community legal centre for some guidance as to whether you may be covered by one or not. Once you've done all those things, or even before you do those things, people often realise they may have an issue when they're checking their payslip. And so it's really important, whether there's an issue or not, to regularly check your pay. Make sure that your pay slips look like they have in the past, if they've always been drafted properly, or if you're unsure, it's just important to have a look at them because you must be given pay slips when you are paid for the work you do. And people can be paid weekly, fortnightly, or monthly. There should be a pay slip that comes within a couple of days of that pay being processed and put into your bank account. There should be a few things that are always on your pay slips no matter what. Things like the hours you worked in the pay cycle, the hourly rate that is attributed to that type of work. Any leave balances should be calculated on the bottom and also documented if you take leave. Say you had a sick day, it should say 8 hours sick personal leave and the amount that was paid out. So if you work on weekends or late into the night and there's penalty rates that apply to that work, they should also be listed there. We find that a big red flag when looking at a pay slip is if all of the hours have been bundled together and a flat rate of say $30 or $25 has been put as what you are paid, because there may be not enough hourly rate there to cover the penalty rates that would have applied if each hour had been paid individually on the pay slip. So if you see things like that, but you know you've been working different hours or longer after an 8-hour day or on a weekend, it's really important to ask a question about that and check, well, why is my pay slip not reflecting what I've actually done during the week? We've also got a QR code here on this slide that takes you to the pay checker. So you can pop in what your role is or how many hours you've worked, what type of work it was, and it'll check that that's appropriate and is the up-to-date hourly rate for that type of work. Another one that's important to keep in mind is working during trial periods. Even if it's a day or a shift, if it's something that's looking as like a trial for a new job or in a different job, it's really important that you make sure you're paid for that time. Some employers will say, no, it's just seeing how you like it. We don't need to pay you for it. We're not sure if we're going to hire you yet. You're not actually an employee. That you can push back on that and say, look, I understand that this is the way things are. There's also a lot of resources online with the Fair Work Ombudsman that you can send to an employer and go, look, this is what they say, and I don't want to make this go any further, but maybe we need to talk to them to figure out how this works for me. So it's really important to take note of those shifts that you do if you are in a trial period, because they still count and you still should be paid for them. I think, yes, Tu has helpfully put the link in there as well for the pay checker. So thank you for that too. I guess this was a little bit of what I was just touching on as to the things that must be included on your pay slips. I mean, if you have a glance at a pay slip, it does look like a lot of lines of different amounts and descriptions, and sometimes we do just kind of glaze over those things, but because life's busy, the money's in our account, it looks the same as the week before. But it is always good to just double check every month or so, okay, what do they look like? Have things changed? Those other things that you should be looking out for are, it should say how much superannuation that you're being paid each cycle of pay that's going into your super fund, and also how much tax has been taken out. So you should have like a before tax figure, the tax that's taken out, and then an after tax figure to make sure that that all matches up with what then hits your bank account. This is a video, but I'm not sure it plays very well. The link is there for you to look at in your own time, of an app you can download from the Fair Work Commission, which is recording your hours for you. It's a fantastic app that works in the background, so you don't need to have it open all the time, but you set your location of work and it will, I think, GPS match where you're when you walk onto the premises and when you leave. So it can keep track of your hours without having to actually write them down, which is really helpful because it is a lot of admin work to like track your hours if you don't have a timesheet when you clock in and clock out at work. And if you're ever unsure, it's just a good thing to check, okay, well, my contract says 25 hours a week, but maybe I'm doing more than that. Do I need to talk to my employer about it? So it's something I'd really recommend everyone have in their phone, even if they do have set hours per week. It can help if you're doing additional hours to keep track of that kind of stuff. Okay.
I don't think the sound is coming through, Lucy. I'm not sure if anyone else is having the same problem.
Well, yeah, I'll leave that one then so that we can keep moving through the slides so there's enough time for questions at the end. But it is a good 3-minute video just of an overview of how that app works if you want to have a look before you download it. So to contextualize the points I was making around pay slips, there's an example one here, which again, you can refer back to later on, that sets out those key pieces of information, how they often look on a pay slip. And I mean, all payroll systems are different. So sometimes it might look different to this, but they're the most important things to look out for and make sure are included on a pay slip. So you can see there, the hourly rate is there, the base hours of that person's work, and then times by the hourly rate gives the amount that they've earned and the time period that that pay covers. So you've got that one is 2 weeks worth of pay. So those are the real important things to look out for, and you'll have that there for reference if you needed to compare it against something. But again, that doesn't fill the gap of getting legal advice on these issues if you're unsure of how to read your pay slip. So moving on to how to ensure your rights in relation to underpayments. Firstly, like we've said, it's important to check your minimum pay rate. You can do that at any point in time during your employment. With underpayments, you've got 6 years from the date an underpayment occurs to pursue that against your employer. So time is on your side with these sorts of claims. And it's really important, if you can, to first discuss your hourly rate or salary with your boss or your colleagues if you're unsure. More often than not, simple things of how to read a payslip or how they're documented can be discussed and hopefully resolved just by a discussion. So it is good to try and have those where you can, or if not, know where to go to get some assistance. And that's where, if say things didn't resolve in the workplace, you might look at lodging a complaint or getting some advice from a different organisation external to your employer. There's a lot of options available. You can join a union if there is one that covers your workforce. You can contact the Fair Work Ombudsman for some guidance and potentially if they've got resources to assist you having a discussion with your employer. Or you can contact Marrickville Legal Centre or your equivalent community legal centre to get some free legal advice on what's going on at work. And so the last point on underpayments that I'll touch on, because it does happen a lot, is people being paid cash in hand completely or partially. So it's not illegal to be paid cash, it's risky. And it's really risky for you as the person receiving the money. So even if you are paid cash in hand, you should still be given a pay slip for that payment. and tax should still be deducted. If you're being paid cash in hand and it's not being documented, so you're not getting pay slips, it's all being done verbally, there's no text, there's no emails, there's no receipts, it can limit your workplace rights, and it can be difficult to prove that you are an employee on the books to exercise those workplace rights. So while it may seem better in the short run, it's only okay if nothing goes wrong, and we can never guarantee that nothing will go wrong, even if that person has the best intentions when they're engaging you with work. So it's really important to keep your own records if they're refusing to keep them themselves. They can even be taking a photo of the cash, trying to date stamp it, put a note as to who gave you the money, when they gave it to you, what you did with it, just to try and give yourself the best chance of building a paper trail if you've got concerns about how they're treating you at work or how much you're being paid for that fact. So the next topic that I'll cover is workplace safety. While we often look at what we're being paid and how we're being treated, it's important to look at, well, what kind of workplace do I have to work in, and is it safe for me and for other workers? Your employer is legally required to ensure that the workplace is safe for workers and also contractors and clients that may come in or out of the premises. And so it's really important to look at, well, as an employee, what do I expect of my employer, and what part do I have to play in making sure we're all getting the benefit of a safe workplace? And so the things that your employer is required to do are to ensure that there's adequate health and safety measures in place at work. That differs workplace to workplace, depending on the risks that are associated with the kind of work you do. So in an office, it might look very different to if you're working in a warehouse or on a cruise ship or something like that. There's always going to be measures that are put in place that are specific to the environment you're working in. But generally speaking, it's really important to keep an eye out for things being like protective equipment and clothing being given to people who need to wear it, health and safety training that's given either upon induction or regularly to all staff. And it also goes as far as ensuring that there isn't bullying or harassment going on in the workplace. So that is something that your employer is responsible for making sure doesn't occur, as so far as reasonable. So they're not going to be able to have everyone under a microscope and make sure it never happens. But if it's brought to their attention, they are responsible for trying to deal with that and mitigate that risk of it continuing. And if they don't, they may be in breach of their responsibilities and obligations to you as a worker. So if you're feeling like you're being subjected particularly to the bullying and harassment, but this goes more broadly to any kind of concerns you might have about safety in the workplace, it's really important to keep a record of your observations or the run-ins that you're having with someone who may be the person creating the risk. That can be something in your phone, it can be in an email, it can be just something that you've given yourself an opportunity to write down what you remembered at the time, date stamp it, and then keep a record of it so you can come back to it, particularly if you notice a pattern of behaviour evolving over time. And so if you do see those things, you should be reporting it, particularly if it is happening to someone else and you've kind of observed those things happening, but also if it's happening to yourself, it can feel isolating to be on the end of those things, but it's really important to understand that you have rights in the workplace and you're well within your rights to make a complaint in relation to something that's happening in your employment. And so if you don't feel like you can approach your boss, it's important to try and approach someone who is in management that you trust, be that human resources or an equivalent if there isn't a human resources department in the workplace, to discuss those concerns that you've got. If they don't do anything or they're not interested in it, then it might be worth considering reaching out to a union or getting advice on your situation from a community legal centre. So those things are all important steps to take. And it's also important to check any workplace policies that might be in place, because they may have a set of procedures or steps that you should, as someone affected by bullying or harassment, take before you escalate things further. And those things are generally designed to be followed. So it's best to use those because they're there for your benefit at the end of the day as an employee. If all else fails, you can make a complaint to the Fair Work Commission. That is called a stop bullying complaint. So that is where the Fair Work Commission will look at what's happened, involve your employer and the perpetrator of the bullying or harassment, and try and mediate between all of the parties to create some kind of agreement where you can safely return to work and work in a way that is safe and doesn't put you at risk psychologically or physically. And so there's another QR code here in this slide that will go through a few questions to see whether or not you are being bullied in the workplace and whether or not you should make a complaint to the Fair Work Commission. Again, it doesn't replace legal advice, but it is a helpful tool to use yourself if you're trying to navigate some issues in the workplace and you don't want to yet escalate them further. And so that brings us to unfair dismissals in the workplace. It's something that we hear a lot of, and sometimes it is used broadly just to describe a situation where a dismissal happened and we didn't think it was fair. But it does have a legal meaning, and it does have specific requirements that need to be met to be able to bring an unfair dismissal application. And so, be a small business or a large business, there are strict rules around how your employer can dismiss you as an employee. They are quite complex in that they require you to have been given warnings, if you've been performance managed, to give you an adequate opportunity to work on the things that have been pointed out to you, to also have an adequate opportunity to respond, if not too serious of an issue, to have an investigation, and for your employer to have formed what's called a reasonable belief that your employment should be brought to an end. There's a lot of hurdles that they need to properly go through to afford you procedural fairness as an employee before they can dismiss you. So if you are dismissed at work and you think, wow, like that just came out of nowhere, that didn't feel right, you were just pulled into a meeting and blindsided by it, or they tried to adopt some kind of process but rushed it along and didn't give you a fair go, it's important that you do seek some legal advice on that pretty quickly, because there's a really strict 21-day time limit that applies to bringing a claim in the Fair Work Commission. And once you're outside of that 21 days, the Fair Work Commission won't accept, I didn't get around to it, as a good enough reason to give you more time. So it is really important that you act upon that quickly to get some advice, just to know where you stand. At the end of the day, you don't have to do anything, but it's just really important to understand what your rights are in that situation in case they have done wrong by you. Another claim that can fall unintentionally under the unfair dismissal umbrella, but it's actually completely different, is a general protections claim. And so we often have people coming to us thinking that they've been unfairly dismissed, but once we scratch the surface a little bit more, it may be that that person was dismissed for exercising a workplace right. They just didn't know that that was the reason why they were let go. And so in your workplace, in all workplaces, an employee is protected from any kind of unfair action against them because they've exercised a workplace right. So your employer can't retaliate if you do things that you're protected and allowed to do under the Fair Work Act. Those can be things like asking questions about your payslip, saying you want to take some annual leave or actually taking the annual leave. It can be negotiating different terms of your employment. It could be asking for flexible working arrangements after you've been at a workplace for 12 months and you have a fair reason for it. They're all things that you as an employee are allowed to do. Even if the answer is no, you shouldn't be treated any worse off than someone who didn't ask anything about their employment. And so that is a very broad way, well, there's a broad way in which employers can take unfair action against you. The most obvious one is being fired, but sometimes it can be a lot more subtle. It can be treating you less favorably, changing your job description, changing your hours, making you work night shift all of a sudden, demoting you, or offering you different terms of employment that are less favourable than the ones you had before. So this can crop up in a number of different situations without someone even realising that it's happening. So if anything like that happens and you feel like it's really being pushed by your employer, it's really important to ask questions and to get some legal advice on it, in case it actually stems back to a time you took sick leave a week ago and you didn't even realise that the two were linked. So that's something that's really important to make sure you get advice on if you're ever unsure. And so to start wrapping things up, because this is a lot of information to take on board and it does look a lot at what happens when the employer does something wrong, it's also important to think about what you need to do as an employee in a workplace to make sure that you're creating the best environment, bringing everything to the table that you need to, but also not contributing to toxic workplace cultures, because they can exacerbate things like bullying or harassment in the workplace. And so your responsibilities as an employee can be really simply summarised as being responsible, being proactive and being respectful. So it's important that you take care of yourself and others. And if you are concerned about any risks in the workplace around health and safety, that you bring them to someone's attention. Also, if you're either being bullied or if someone is bullying someone else, harassing them or discriminating against them, to speak up and to at least share that with someone who you can trust in the workplace. And then lastly, being respectful seems like a no-brainer, but it's appreciating cultural and social differences and no matter what, treating everyone fairly in the workplace. Really important but simple things to keep in mind when you are entering a new workplace, you've been there for years, or you're looking at leaving. It's very important that you adopt those steps to make sure that you're doing the best that you can in the workplace that you're in. And so that brings me to just a bit more information on resources. I know we've got a few links that have been floating around there, but this is more so about what each organisation does, because there can be some confusion around the difference between the Fair Work Ombudsman and the Fair Work Commission, because they are completely separate, even though their names are very similar. So the Fair Work Ombudsman, I've got the contact details there for them. What they focus on is they focus on the entitlements that you have as a worker in the workplace. They look at things like pay, they look at the modern awards, they look at enterprise agreements, they look at anything to do with those kinds of underpayment related issues. They're the people to go to. They're also an investigating regulatory body that can go into a workplace and investigate concerns. The Fair Work Commission, on the other hand, is a tribunal that is where you would lodge a claim for bullying or an unfair dismissal or a general protections claim. So you go there if you've got concerns in relation to those kinds of complaints or treatment in the workplace. They also have information and a lot of resources, so they are the best place to go if you're looking for something up to date, be it around COVID, around laws changing, or just around any kind of thing in the workplace that might pop up, like how much notice am I meant to be paid if I'm terminated, or what's redundancy pay, what's annual leave, what's sick leave, what's the difference? They've got a lot of resources that you can access there. They've also got a really handy hotline called the Workplace Advice Service, where you can put a request in for free legal advice from a partner organisation. And so that partner organisation could be a private firm, it could be us, it could be any different organisation that signs up to it, but you'll get a free legal advice from someone who is more often than not a specialist in employment law. So it's a really good place to go to if you're stuck and you're not sure where to go to first. And then another one to keep in mind are your community legal centres. So it'll always be free legal advice if you're eligible. And then we all have a priority to try and assist you if we can on an ongoing basis. It is case by case, but it's really important if you're finding that, say, the Fair Work Ombudsman or Commission can't help you, that you don't just go, okay, well, I tried and leave it. There are other organisations out there that can help you with your issues. So if you're not sure of what one covers you in terms of where you live, you can go onto the CLC New South Wales website and find out. If Marrickville Legal Centre is someone you know, in terms of like an organisation you've got a contact at, or if you are familiar with us because you've seen these presentations, you can always reach out to us, and if we can't assist, we can put you in touch with someone who can. So it's always good to just even make that first contact to see, what do you think? Where could I go? Can you help me? And we'll do our best to be able to assist you however we can. And then other places, if say all of the above didn't work, legal aid is there in certain circumstances to help, particularly with employment law. You can contact them as well. And also Unions New South Wales, if you're interested in joining a union, or if you are someone who is a member of a union and you have a question, you can contact them and get assistance through their hotlines as well. So that wraps things up for me. Happy to go to any questions that anyone may have.
Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Yes, yeah, go for it if you've got any questions. Happy to answer them as best I can. No, maybe we'll test everyone out with the quiz, and then if that prompts any questions, we can discuss from there.
Okay, sure. Yeah, you might have just been really.
I have a question.
Great.
Yeah.
I just want to know, like, how do you know if you're like paid appropriately for your job, if you've been underpaid, as you mentioned before?
Yeah, so it's usually just doing a little bit of research, looking at the Fair Work Ombudsman's website. You can type in like the description of your role. So say you were a retail assistant, you could type in retail assistant and it'll give you like a drop down box of all the different awards that may cover you. And then you can click through it and it'll tell you the current hourly rates for that award and that job.
Do you have a website for that?
Yeah, I think it was one of the links that Tu popped into the chat.
Okay.
If not, we can send it around. But yeah, that's the first way you can check yourself against any kind of award or experience that you might have, because the rates do increase as your experience increases if you're covered by a modern award. If you're not, and say you're on a salary arrangement, then it's just looking at, well, if I go back to an hourly rate on that salary, is it above the minimum wage? Okay. So there's a couple of different ways to do it. But if you can't figure it out, that's where you could call the Fair Work Ombudsman and they could probably do that over the phone with you.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
I have a question, Lucy. This is Anne here. I've got students who often do, you know, casual work, and most of them are fairly new arrivals in Australia, say, been here a bit over 2 years or whatever. But a couple of things. One is, should they get paid for lunch breaks, or that's not a common thing to be paid for lunch breaks?
Generally not. If it's in a contract of employment that says, look, we will pay you for X, Y, and Z, then it very may well be covered. But if there's nothing in it, the Fair Work Act doesn't say that you're paid for lunch breaks, no. There might be some awards that have provision for paid breaks, but it would then depend on each award and what the role is within it as to whether or not that applies.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And the other thing with unions, are they likely to sort of, you know, find out if there are new workers being put on in, because the work sites that most of my the people that I deal with, you know, it's cleaning jobs and that sort of thing, but they really don't know, they wouldn't know how to go contact a union, for instance.
Right.
You know,
so not the employers don't go and report back to a union and say, look, we've had X amount of onboarded new employees. It's more so the individual going and seeking out that information if they're interested. If there's a pre-existing union workforce, it's usually something that's part of like the induction is, look, this exists. If you want to join, you can. But if there's no real union presence at that employer, it may be that that person needs to just seek it out or seek out that information themselves.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And just with the unfair unfair dismissal application, how long would that normally take if they submit an application for them to hear back? Is that sort of, they say they'll be back to them in 2 weeks or a month, or?
Yeah, so it does depend on the current capacity that the unfair dismissal team have at the Fair Work Commission. So we find that if you lodge your claim, you'll hear back pretty quickly within a week once you pay the filing fee, and then you'll get a notification of the time and date for the telephone call that is kind of like the first step in the process with all of the parties and a mediator. And so that can often fall within 4 to 6 weeks of when you file. If they're really under the pump, it might be 8 weeks. Or if they have cancellations, you might get a date really quickly. It's usually no longer than 2 months, but it does really depend on their workload, and it changes all the time. Sometimes we'll have people file and they'll get one really quickly, and then they might go, look, I didn't get one till July. So it does really depend.
Okay. And is it done online initially?
Yeah, they're over the phone initially. So it's a phone call at that first conciliation step with all of the parties, and it's run by a Fair Work Commission member.
Okay. And just one other thing, sorry to take up time. The slides that you've used today, are we able to have access to them, or?
Yes, I believe 2 will be circulating them at the end, and this will also be recorded.
Great. Okay, well, it's been fabulous. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions? I think Victoria's got her hands up.
Oh, yes. Oh, I think you're muted.
Can you unmute yourself, Victoria? We can't hear your question. While she's doing that, I've just, for those who are leaving us early, I've just popped in 2 links. So one is the quiz link, just to test your knowledge on some really key information from today's workshop, and also to the feedback form. We'd really appreciate if you can complete that. It will just help us continually improve our sessions in the future. So those are in the chat, and I think Victoria is now unmuted.
Perfect. Thanks too.
Thank you.
So, hello. When
Hi.
I work with married working women, so most of them work in the factory, and some issue like they rent me relate to harassment, bullying at work, and you know the big company, and they divide like separate the supervised side and other worker side, and because the reason, like the group of workers, they stay with the supervised side because they want like the supervised treatment different with other one. So they get they report to manager, but didn't resolve yet, and they fighting at work, like they fighting at work, and they leave the job. And big factory in Southwest Sydney.
Yeah.
And most of them like Vietnamese background, and they speak Vietnamese, but some of them good English, so they stay with the boss side, and the supervisor listen to that group, and other group like if you not stay with the boss the supervisor side, you have to work like very hard work, and they change the shift all the time. they feel not fair for them, but they can keep and they fighting in the lunch break. They fight, and then she left the job. She called me.
Yeah.
Automatically she left the job. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Like if she make a complaint, she needs the evidence. But how she keep the evidence?
Yeah, so sometimes it's just having to write it in your phone in a note, telling someone, putting it in a notebook that you keep at home. It's just important to keep something in writing that says, on this date, this happened between this person and this person. These people were witnesses, because things are busy, time passes, and it's hard to remember those things, even for the best of us. So it's really important to keep that record, because then if you decide to make a complaint, or say you are dismissed or you're forced out, if someone's going to try and help you, they're going to want to know what happened. And that's a really good way to then go, look here, I kept these notes. This is what happened, and this is what I saw, or this is what was said to me, and this is what happened to me. And that really helps then from our perspective as lawyers, or from someone supporting that person, to then figure out, well, how can we help you? How can we help you? What's the best thing for you to do in that situation?
You know, no one in the workplace wants to support her. She feels very alone, and because they scare a lot of job, you know, they scare a lot of job, so no witness at all. And she says she just find that's one, and she walk out of the job, by herself.
It's hard when it gets to that point and people decide to leave, because when you leave, it does limit your options in terms of a claim against them, because they didn't fire you. So it's important, if people can, to get advice before they have to make that kind of hard decision, because there could be things that could be done that avoid it.
Yeah, so very hard. She ran me and she asked, I say, you fire all the people in the workplace, this you wrong, because she started a fight with her. This relate to like domestic violence at work.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's awful. Yeah, well, please do encourage them to seek legal advice and support from a community legal centre, or the Fair Work Commission if they do need it, because it's really important that that stuff doesn't fall between the cracks and go undealt with.
Thank you. Yeah, so I will refer them to like community legal advice. Yeah.
Does anyone else have any other questions for Lucy? I can see that someone has completed the form and the quiz and got 100%, so that's great.
Good work.
We're in the chat room.
Yeah, it's in the chat. There are two links. So the first link is to the quiz. That's just to test the knowledge. And then the second link is to the feedback form. So you can complete that in your own time, but we would really appreciate if you do spare a couple of minutes to complete the feedback form. No worries, Gulvi. She's got to go. I think most people are dropping out now, so I don't know if anyone else has any other questions for Lucy before we wrap up. I'd just like to thank Lucy too. I don't know if she mentioned that Lucy is our employment lawyer and the assistant managing principal solicitor at Marrickville Legal Centre. So she runs the employment legal service here. And I think Raymond's got his hand up.
Thanks for that too. Hi, Raymond.
You just have to unmute Raymond.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now.
All right, sorry. I mean, I said I came a bit late, about 7 minutes. Yeah, but thank you so much. This is very educative, and it has refreshed my memories, and I'll pass it on to my community members. The only other thing I wanted to ask was, if like you are in a company with a shift work and one or two workers can't make it to the job, and they give you to do the extra job for their roles. So what normally happens with that?
Yeah,
Are you entitled to anything?
So if the role is different in that it's, say, day to day, you are a floor worker, but then you have to cover a supervisor's shift and it has additional responsibilities, you should be paid the right rate for that work at a more senior level. You shouldn't just be paid your rate for everything, particularly if it's very different work. If it's the same work and they're asking you to work longer, or come back within, say, 6 hours of shift working ending, it would depend on the terms of your agreement as to how long between shifts you should have off, if they're breaching any rules, and also if there's any penalty rates that may apply for doing that extra work. So it would really come down to the agreement that you've got and any modern award that sits over that agreement. But if you're unsure, that's something that the Fair Work Ombudsman can help with, or a community legal centre can help figure out as well, particularly if it's happening often.
All right. Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Yeah.
Thank you, Raymond. Are there any final questions for Lucy before we wrap up the session today? Well, please stay connected. If something pops up or you have clients or students or anyone else that needs legal advice in the future, particularly around employment law, feel free to reach out to us. I think everyone has my email now, so I can make a referral to the team. We also have the contact form on our website, and also on our website there's a number that people can call directly to our services, so that you can be booked in for legal advice, or you can make a referral to someone to call us directly to book in an appointment. We also have a legal chatbot on our website for those who don't like to pick up the phone. So that's also another option for you to get in contact with our service.